So this presentation is going to focus on Chapter 14 of the Quest for Environmental Justice, addressing global poverty, pollution, and human rights. And it really looks at economic development and environmental health. So these are the learning outcomes. So the chapter starts off by discussing the role of globalization and environmental health. And it states that an increased globalization over the past 100 to 50 years has caused ecosystem strain on the underdeveloped, low-income countries, especially those countries in which resources are being pulled from, such as oil, timber, and minerals. And unfortunately, the development of transnational corporations have allowed companies to go into countries with very little to no environmental regulations, the best tax incentives, and the cheapest labor, because it helps them build the most profit. However, it puts those populations in which they're going to at an increased risk from environmental hazards. And one of the themes two of the themes that are going to be sort of reoccurring throughout this presentation are the domino effect and global economic apartheid. And the domino effect really just says that an environmental effect in one country has the capability to affect countries surrounding it, as well as have an effect worldwide. And global economic apartheid is basically the concept that there are countries who have the capability to produce, consume, and borrow goods, and there are countries who are unable to. And the amount of poverty and the amount of environmental hazards are increased in those countries who are unable to produce, consume, and borrow. So there is a direct relationship between pollution and poverty. Those in the most impoverished places are living in environments and they are exposed to more hazards, such as no or limited access to clean water, air quality that is very low, inadequate food supplies, inadequate shelter, and inadequate access to energy. And unfortunately, 25% of preventable diseases in the world are directly linked to environmental factors. And those hazards that I just listed are connected to those preventable diseases. And so a majority of the deaths caused by environmental factors can be linked to 3 specific problems. There's obviously more, but the ones that are discussed and most studied are contaminated drinking water, untreated human excrement, and air pollution. So water poverty and inadequate sanitation. The United Nations World Development Report 2017 states that in low-income countries, 8% of industrial and municipal wastewater undergoes treatment of any kind. So that's only 8%. The rest of that water is going uncleaned, unsanitized, untreated, and is going back to populations and used as drinking water and cooking water, which links back into that 25% of preventable diseases being caused by environmental hazards. In 2012, 842,000 deaths in middle and low-income countries were caused by contaminated drinking water, inadequate hand-washing facilities and sanitation services. And the fact here about the CDC WASH report just continues to emphasize this point that in low-income countries, the environmental hazards, health hazards are much greater due to a lack of infrastructure, a lack of health treatment, a lack of the government attempting to decrease this global apartheid. If you walk outside in Fairfax or in many parts of Virginia, you are breathing very clean air. You don't see and you don't feel the effects of air pollution. Walk outside in New York City, walk outside in China, walk outside in Jordan, in some of these underdeveloped, developing, or big cities, and you can see a layer of haze, a layer of pollution. And unfortunately, in 2012, 7 million deaths, about 1 out of 8 globally, were caused by air pollution exposure. And that can be indoor air pollution, outdoor air pollution, but the pollution is caused oftentimes by these large corporations going into countries and releasing their pollutants, and then those populations, those native populations, are affected by it. So another topic that was discussed in the chapter, which has been discussed earlier in the semester, was about global dumping grounds. And Basel Convention was a treaty that was designed to reduce the movement of hazardous waste between nations, especially from developed to less developed. And there are legal actions for exporting or importing hazardous or toxic waste. Yet, an MIT study stated that in 2010, about 258.2 million computers, TVs, and phones were discarded in the U.S., only 66% of which were recycled, and about 120 million phones were shipped to Hong Kong, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And oftentimes these countries where the waste is shipped to don't have the adequate infrastructure or resources to dispose of the waste, and so which increases the hazards and the risks that they are exposed to. Additionally, pesticides have been shipped to other countries, and there have been cases of pesticide poisonings, and oftentimes they go from, again, developed countries to underdeveloped countries that do not have the means to dispose of those pesticides. There have also been multiple environmental tragedies that have occurred due to this sort of globalization, such as the Bhopal in India, the Chernobyl tragedy in the Soviet Union / the Ukraine, and the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska. So this chapter is really focusing on climate justice, and it comes down to the point that adverse effects of climate change affect those who are most vulnerable, those who are living in the low-income countries, the underdeveloped countries, populations that are made up of mostly minorities. And some of these effects include increased food and electrical prices, the loss of herbal plants that are used in medications, and there's really become this global advocacy movement that enforces or advocates for equal environmental protection, human rights enforcement, reduction of the gap between the rich and the poor, so sort of bridging that global apartheid gap, and fighting for cultural and social rights, and really improving health systems. And one in particular that was discussed in the chapter was the National Black Environmental Justice Network Sustainable Development List, which sort of covers topics such as environmental challenges in development, health system improvements, sustainable energy, international agencies, and government policies. And it's really trying to reduce environmental racism, and again, bridge that gap between those who are able to produce, consume, and borrow, and those who are not, and those who are subjected to the corporations' environmental health effects. And it really comes down to this anti-globalization movement, and basically it's this anti-globalization movement is not saying that globalization shouldn't occur. It's saying that globalization needs to focus more on social justice, human rights, and democracy, and take into account those who are in those underdeveloped countries being forcibly subjected to health hazards, and really focuses on advocating for those minority populations and those vulnerable populations because they cannot advocate for themselves. So these are the sources that were used. And yes.